eBay buyers will lie on the platform to get free stuff, and it's our job as resellers to protect our own business. I've dealt with all kinds of bad buyers and scammers over the years of selling on the eBay platform. However, this was a new one even for me. The complaint was nothing special. It was who the complaint was coming from. It started out simple enough with a buyer sending me a message about wanting to return a pair of boots that do not fit them. However, they claimed that they did not fit because they were not a woman's boot as listed. However, they were men's boots. Returns are not the end of the world, and sometimes, especially with clothing and shoes, items just don't fit and customers need to make that return. But this buyer in particular was clearly setting the scene for a free return. Now, I personally offer returns to all my buyers for any reason, including the item doesn't fit. However, it's buyer paid returns, which means that the buyer is responsible for paying for shipping both ways. Now, this kind of fraud is going to happen from time to time. Buyers will simply lie about the condition of the item or about the item just to get that free return. I've personally seen it all, from people lying about the color of the item to the fact that the item doesn't work even though it is working, just to get that free return on the item and save themselves a few dollars. So this lady was nothing new to me. As soon as I saw her setting the scene for this, I sent her back a message saying, "I'm sorry that the boots don't fit. However, I do accept returns, so feel free to open a return request. However, I do want to note that these are women's boots as described in the listing." And then I went on to explain how I know for a fact that these are women's boots. I explained how she could look at the factory code on the boots and do a quick Google search to pull up the exact model that she had in her hand, along with going through how you can look at the size chart to figure out if these are men's or women's boots. If you ever struggle with figuring out whether it's a men's boot or a woman's boot, one of the simplest ways to do it is by looking at the different conversions. Look at the US size compared to the UK or EU size, and you'll quickly be able to determine whether it's a woman's boot or a men's boot by just looking at the different conversions. I explained all this to her, but I also made it very clear that she is absolutely welcome to open a return request and send them back as they don't fit her. I actually kind of assumed that this would be the end of this, because most times if I push back even slightly with these types of buyers, they kind of just go away. After all, she could have just opened a return request and said that the boots were men's to start with. However, the fact is she actually went out of her way to send me that message to kind of set this whole scene up. Even though I thought that that was going to be the end of it, this lady was something different. She continued to message me multiple times explaining to me that if they were a woman's boot, that they would fit because that's her shoe size. She stopped being logical and just started going off saying that if these boots don't fit, it's my fault that they don't fit because her foot hasn't changed. She even went as far to send me pictures of the boots next to some of her pairs of shoes, saying, "Look at the size difference here. These can't possibly be women's boots." However, the fact is these were heavy-duty winter boots. They will not be the same size as a pair of shoes, at least from the looks, because there's more material on winter boots. There's more material on boots in general. So of course they will look larger than, say, a pair of shoes. Either way, I wanted to be done talking to her, so I simply sent back saying, "Feel free to open up that return request. However, I am noting that these are women's boots." And I thought that might be the end of it. But sure enough, a few days later, she opens a return request. When I go in and I look at the return request details, I actually find it kind of funny. She stopped arguing the fact that these were not women's boots and instead claimed that these were counterfeit boots because the tag didn't look correct. I hate to tell her, but no one was making counterfeits of these boots and they were legit, and they might not have fit her because different brands fit differently. However, it wasn't a big deal. She could just send them back. But the way she opened this case by saying that the item was not described, it means that I have to pay the shipping both directions. I have to fully refund her, and I get a ding on my account for selling an item not as described. Now, honestly, this still isn't that big of a deal. She's not going to be the first customer to commit this kind of fraud, and she's certainly not going to be the last customer to do so. So it's just something we have to get used to. However, since I was paying for the shipping label, I wanted to see where they were shipping from. So I looked at her address and it was kind of unique. So I did a quick Google search and sure enough, it was linked to a pretty popular university. So my first thought was, oh, okay, it's a broke college student. At least that makes me feel a little bit better. But that's where I was wrong. When I searched the address, her name actually came up on it. She's actually a fairly popular professor at that university, from writing multiple books to even being heavily involved in the local politics. Now, obviously, I'm not going to put her on blast over a $50 return of some boots. However, I do find it interesting that she would have these boots sent to her workplace and commit fraud using her name and her workplace to save a few dollars on a return for something that simply just does not fit. But then again, I've even had a business buy some high-end phones from me, and when they received the phones at their business address, they stole the phones from me and instead filled the box back up with a bunch of garbage broken phones and shipped it back to me and committed fraud using their company name and address. So honestly, nothing surprises me anymore. These scammers on eBay have been completely out of control. This is the third one this month where someone has bought an item from me and sent back a completely different item. This time, it was actually someone that owns their own business, and they bought it with their own business address, their own business name. They sent these phones to themselves at their local business and then sent me back their broken old used phones, and they're not even the same model of phone. And once again, eBay refuses to do anything about this. People just don't care anymore, and they don't even pretend to hide what they're doing. This is the world we are selling in, and if we want to last, we have to have a plan. Now, I know what you're thinking. All that time spent telling this story, it's happened to every single person. I'm nothing special. This story is nothing special. It happens every day. And I would agree. You're completely right. At the end of the day, all I was out was about $20 in shipping fees. This isn't the end of the world, and accepting returns and having people commit little fraud like this isn't going to kill my business. But what I want to cover today is how returns and even fraud can hurt a new seller to the platform. With the holiday season right around the corner, we're going to start to see an increase in the amount of returns we get. In fact, I'm already seeing that on my end. Just by coming out of summer and going into winter, I am selling more clothing, more jeans, more jackets, more winter boots. And because of the items I'm selling, I am seeing my return rate slightly increase since the summer months. Now, this is not any big deal. I accept the returns, the buyer sends it back, I relist it and sell it again. It's not the end of the world. But I guarantee you that if you are in any Facebook or reselling groups online, you're going to see this post very soon. And it's going to come from someone, and they're going to simply say, I sold a $1,000 item 20 days ago and the buyer just opened a return. What am I supposed to do? Now, the seller that posts this comment is likely very panicked and very angry. They're going to be looking for a way to get out of the return. However, people in the comments are going to tell them that they really have no other way other than to accept the return. The problem the seller doesn't want to explain is that the seller already spent that money and they are panicking. After all, maybe they just sell part-time, or maybe they needed some extra money around the holiday season. So they sold a few things around their house. They had one big item that sold and they were like, sweet. And they went ahead and they had a great Christmas with their family. However, right after Christmas, they ended up getting this return request, and now they are super panicked because they already spent all of that money. They are in a really tough place because at the end of the day, when that buyer returns that item, they owe the buyer a refund, whether they have that money or not. When I see these posts, I always feel bad for the people. We've all been there. We've all sold things, taken the money, and went and spent it, only to have that return request come in and say, dang, now we have to try to scramble to find enough money to cover that return request. But the good news is this is completely avoidable if you just set some of the money to the side. Now, me as a full-time eBay reseller, I rely on this income. So I always have a decent amount of money set to the side to cover a few major returns or a bunch of smaller returns because stuff just happens. But even if you don't sell full-time, and even if you're only selling a few items for some extra Christmas money around the holidays, make sure that you put at least some of that money over to the side, because that money is not technically yours until that return window and the credit card chargeback window have both passed. And it doesn't matter whether you offer returns or not. The buyer can simply lie and say that the item doesn't match the description, and eBay is going to force you to accept that return. And when you get that return back, eBay is going to force you to refund that customer. Now, this isn't meant to scare you. Honestly, even during this time of year, my return rate is below 3% across all of my items, across all the categories, and across all the reasons, with the major reason being the item just doesn't fit. Bad buyers are pretty rare on the platform. Most buyers are honest and going to open up the return the correct way, and full-on scams or fraud is even rarer on the eBay platform. However, just because it's rare doesn't mean that it can't happen. In fact, I even had someone rent a camera from me for the last couple months. This person had purchased a camera from me, and about 25 days after they had purchased the camera, they opened a return request. They waited a few more weeks before they finally ended up returning that camera. Now, this was an underwater camera that I'm assuming that they went ahead and used on vacation. They didn't open the return request saying that the item was broken or saying that the item didn't match the description. They simply opened the return request saying that they ordered this item by mistake. But I guess it took them 25 days to realize that it was a mistake to buy this item. Now, this isn't a big deal because I ended up getting the camera back in fully working condition. However, it's worth noting that that entire time that that buyer had the item and returned the item was being shipped back to me, I had to have that money ready to refund the buyer. So not only was the item being tied up, but my money was also being tied up. And that's why I can't recommend enough that you would put at least some of the money that you make from sales off to the side to cover these returns. Because there is no worse feeling in the world than getting a return and feeling like someone is taking food out of your mouth. And it can simply be avoided by just having that little bit of money set to the side. When I have that money set to the side to cover these returns, I don't even blink an eye. It's like, I'm getting a return, not a big deal, I'll resell it again. However, if you don't have the money, it can really hurt and it can really feel like the customer is doing something bad to you. My hope with this video is that everyone that watches it never finds themselves in this situation. They start putting a little bit of money off to the side to cover their returns, and they never end up with a major return that they can't afford. It's fun to celebrate those big sales, those $1,000 plus sales. That is a super great day, and it is definitely worth celebrating. However, remember, that money isn't technically yours until the return window and that credit card chargeback time has elapsed. With the holiday season coming and Boxing Day right after Christmas, the returns are coming. The only question is, are you ready for them? If you've enjoyed this video, I think you're going to love this one, so go ahead and give it a click.